I think if someone asked themselves the question, if I had a loved one, let's say my son or daughter or father or sister, someone who I really cared about, and they were going to go to see a ketamine specialist, what would I look for? Would it be a clinic where someone's just left alone by themselves, or would it be where there's a doctor there on site? Would it be whether there's a nurse? Like, what would you personally feel safest with?
Three, two, one. Liftoff.
Welcome back to the Ketamine Startup Podcast. It's great to be back with you for our first new episode of 2026. And after sharing a couple episodes from the vault in December, Sam and I are excited to dive back into fresh content. This podcast is where we talk about how to start up a ketamine infusion clinic, how to market it, and more. And speaking of running your clinic, have you ever wondered if you actually need to be in the room for every single treatment? Maybe you're burning out from traditional healthcare, or you're trying to figure out if you can scale beyond what you personally can handle in a day. Well, in this episode, Sam and I are breaking down the real answer to whether a licensed physician needs to be present during ketamine treatments. We'll cover the current regulatory landscape, what scope of practice issues you need to consider, the different staffing model clinics are actually using, and how to think about risk versus patient care. This is based on how we ran our own clinic, what we researched, plus what we've learned from talking to clinic owners using different models across the country. Before we dive in, though, a quick disclaimer. This information we're sharing is for educational purposes only. Regulations vary by state, and you should always consult with qualified legal and medical professionals about scope of practice and supervision requirements specific to your location and practice structure. Now, let's jump into the episode.
This is a super common question. It's probably the one we get most asked regarding like, hey, do I need to be in the room when the patient's getting an infusion? And I think it really depends on your personal goals and the regulations that may apply. So again, each state is going to have a different rule, and some states it's quite unregulated. But I think if someone asked themselves the question, if I had a loved one, let's say my son or daughter or father or sister, someone who I really cared about, and they were going to go to see a ketamine specialist, what would I look for? Would it be a clinic where someone's just left alone by themselves, or would it be where there's a doctor there on site? Would it be whether there's a nurse? Like, what would you personally feel safest with? And I think by answering that question for yourself, then you'll know how you want to run your office and your clinic. So I think that's really the key. And there's different staffing models where there are clinics where people are just left alone and there's a camera on them, or they're monitored by an EMT, or they're monitored by a medical assistant, or they're monitored one-on-one by the doctor the entire time, or a CRNA or an NP. So there's this huge variability in how it's run. And I would say it depends on your comfort level and your state regulations. Now, personally, we think it's really important to have someone in the office and inside of the room. I know there's differing opinions on that, and that's completely fine. Some people are like, oh no, if as long as there's a camera on them and they have a little clicker button where they can reach out to me, like that's completely fine. And some patients like that. They're like, I just want to be left alone and do my own thing. So it's really variable. But the ketamine experience, it's pretty vulnerable, right? They're getting a general anesthetic. Sure, it's a subdissociative dose, but they're quite vulnerable. They're open. And I think having someone who's trained and a professional in the room, like there's also a sense of safety that comes from it.
I think this question that we get highlights some other questions, some other things, issues, or variables that the clinician is juggling, the future ketamine therapy provider is juggling, because many people are coming from traditional healthcare where they're overworked and they're already been overburdened, told how to practice in a certain way, so they're reimbursed appropriately, so the hospital can recoup costs or whatever. So there's this tension of how much do I really need to do? And then there's also this balancing of, oh, actually now you have this new way to practice because it is your own practice. There are no administrators telling you how to practice at that point on how much you should do, aside from any regulations we're going to be talking about in a little bit. And I think there's this tension of I want to balance having my autonomy, my personal freedom, and also providing quality care and good service to my community and just navigating that. And I think that's highlighted by what you were saying about what would you want for your loved one, but also recognizing that going to open your own business is a lot of work. And there's a lot of things you're also going to be juggling, wearing many hats when you first start out. And so I feel even though at some time, like we believe, and I would want for my family, a physician in the room within walking to, in or next door to come in immediately. I also recognize why the question we is asked from us, like, do I really need to? And sometimes I notice that for some people that ask us that, they're coming in a little burnt out or thinking, I want to scale and to scale at a level in which they can provide this transformative treatment for others. And so the economics and the math behind having a physician in every single room for every infusion may not fit that model if they really want to be able to scale this. And so with that in mind, let's talk about the regulatory landscape. And I know, Sam, you've been an expert faculty for ASKP so maybe you can provide some insights on that. And
Yeah, I know that there's, as far as at the federal USA level, there really aren't regulations requiring doctors' presence during infusions. They kind of outsource that to the states. And they're like, hey, we'll just let the states figure it out and do their own thing. So, as one example, like Texas state, I think there's recent legislation or requirements that a physician has to be present in the office. And I know there's some challenges because some of the clinics that were owned in Texas were like by CRNAs, for example, or nurse practitioners with the medical director who was not necessarily on site. So that's happening in Texas. I know in other states that on this they're requiring very specific presence requirements. Like I think Utah state, they require, and please correct me, you can double check and fact check me, but I think they require someone with like an anesthesia or ACLS or BLS training. I forget which one, but there are unique state regulations on who needs to be present at the office inside of the room. So this is really the key of, talking with the state medical board, seeing what other clinics are doing in your state. Now in California, which, that's where we practice, there really are no regulations as far as physical presence requirements that I know of. I know that clinicians have to practice within their scope, and that's variable. So if it's a PA or an NP or an MD or a DO or an RN, like it really depends on what their scope of practice is. And I guess this is why people think about the ketamine field as kind of the Wild West in a way, because these questions are not fully answered quite yet. And even, I guess ketamine therapy has been around since like what, 2013, 2012, 2011, something like that. So what is that, roughly 10, 15 years, 20 years. And, it's still pretty early on in the grand scheme of things, right? And so there is not one exact way to do it or not one exact requirement. Now, as a ASKP expert faculty member, and I'm also was the co-chair of the standards committee, and we're working on these various guidelines for, like, hey, what should be done, what screening, who should be present, et cetera. And those publications are still pending, but that is something that we're working on. And I think it's really important for clinicians to like kind of monitor and police themselves rather than have another regulatory agency do it for us.
And that seems to happen when something bad, a crisis or a tragedy happens, that external entity comes in to police, since we did not self-police. And going back to what you mentioned, you highlighted, like, I think we're all familiar in healthcare about scope of practice. We understand this is the role, this is what I can and cannot do, but I work collaboratively with somebody that can continue that care at a higher level that I can't provide. And so we're very familiar with, okay, we recognize that we have our scope of practice, and then there are some states that are more strict defining who can practice in particular and for what. Because, like Sam was mentioning, I believe Texas is where they put ketamine as a anesthesia service. And again, the idea here with this episode is to get you thinking about these things, right? And to fact check things yourself as well. And so with like Texas, I think it needs to like have airway, you have to have advanced airway training. And I think that's also the same thing you had mentioned Utah with. And so some states, they've clearly delineated practice within your scope of practice. Plus, you need this.
Advanced training.
We're all familiar with all our healthcare training that there were levels of supervision, right? Depending on your level of training or licensing or accreditation, certification, then you could do more and or less. Again, there are variations. And I think so like to like really boil it down, federally, there isn't this has to happen a certain way. That doesn't exist. It has been outsourced to the state level. Would that be a
Yeah, I think
correct?
the other caveat though is like we had made notes about this. Like the DEA is a federal agency, so the DEA is going to have specific rules and regulations which kind of go nationwide. But then the practice of medicine is like a state specific thing. One example of this would be, classically Washington State. They allow nurse practitioners and CRNAs to like own their own private practice, whereas in California State, it has to be owned by a physician, or the majority owner has to be owned by a physician or a licensed healthcare provider. So the corporate practice of medicine laws are also going to affect this regulatory landscape. And it's really crucial. Again, I think ties back to another prior episode where we talked about talking with a business attorney that's state specific, medical specific, so they know exactly how they can support you for these unique laws, and particular the laws regarding scope of practice in that state.
Hey, listeners, this is Kim, and I just want to acknowledge that you're here for a reason. Maybe you're stuck in a cycle of long shifts, feeling a little burnt out, and wondering if there's any other way to practice medicine, especially on your own terms. We've been there, and that's exactly why we created this free checklist, your step-by-step roadmap to starting a ketamine clinic without those costly mistakes. Grab your copy now at www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist. It's completely free because we want you to succeed, not struggle. And hey, if you're driving or mid-workout, don't sweat it. Just check out the show notes for the link when you're ready. And again, that's www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist. Now let's get back to the episode. You have to talk about what's the right decision for you. So after making sure, talking with a professional in your state of who can actually do this, then you got to cover about what's your philosophy behind the way you practice. Why some clinics prefer to do it one way versus the other. And I think that's something that's really important. That's something that I know what we teach our students is we want let me put it this way. No two ketamine infusion clinics are alike, just like how no two people are alike. And sometimes some clinics have things happen that end up in the news and in the media, or some sort of tragedy happens that's ketamine therapy related. And when you start digging through the court case, or you learn about it, or you read about it, you hear there's like, oh, there's some practices that, well, technically may be legal, or in some cases, like Matthew Perry, was very illegal. Some of it you just go, okay, maybe sometimes it's legal, maybe it was okay, but was it really wise? Was it really something done out of integrity? So I think that's something that I really want to take some time to talk with you about this, Sam, about what's our philosophy. What is it that, there's a standard that we want to hold ourselves to? And you mentioned policing ourselves, regulating ourselves.
Yeah, at least at our clinic, I am present for all the infusions. I'm in the office. Sometimes I step out of the room if I have to start an IV or start another patient, but I'm always immediately available. It's not like a nurse who's doing it all by themselves and I'm drinking a cup of coffee at the coffee store. Like, no, I'm always present. I think that's just the safest way. I feel really comfortable with the airway issues, we have ACLS meds available, we have advanced airway equipment. So I think being present is really crucial. Yeah, that's just the way that I would want to be treated personally, and that's the way I want to practice. And we actually recommend that to our students where, hey, start with being the doctor or the clinician who's there during the infusions. That way, even if you do delegate it or you hire a CRNA or a nurse practitioner, an advanced practice provider, that you'll know, like, hey, this is the process. And I know we've had some people reach out to us and they're like, oh, what's the best way to put it? They're more profit motivated. And it's like, what's the minimum that I can do so that I can make money and not have to do a lot of work? And I would say for those people who are in that mindset, which if you're listening to this podcast episode, you're definitely not, most likely not, then don't worry about that. But don't have it be about profits. I mean, we do live in a capitalistic society, so it makes sense, of course. We want to create win-wins and create enough money to pay our bills and student loans, etc. But also, like, I feel like we have an ethical responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility, a moral responsibility to do right by our patients. And of course, that's not like one clear answer all the time. It's variable and it'll depend upon each individual clinician. But like, hey, like look around, like what are people doing? Because the ketamine community is small and people are going to say, yeah, don't go to that clinic because they're super sketchy and they do this, or they're going to say, yeah, definitely go see that doctor or that clinician because they always do right and they have a lot of integrity. So you want to have that reputation. And they say that trust takes years to build and seconds to lose. So being cognizant of that trust that you're building as you open up your medical practice and clinic.
We talk a lot about physician well-being or healthcare provider well-being or just person well-being on our podcast and our within our Ketamine Startup brand. And what's coming up for me right now is that sounds like a lot of work. And you're my partner in life and partner in business. And I see how much it takes to run a practice and then also be there with integrity for taking care of a patient, right? So, how does that work with balancing your well being, balancing the well being of your practice, working on the non medical side, but then also providing high level care, mental presence to hold space? Like, how does, because I know then most likely there's going to be somebody listening to this podcast. They're not profit driven, but they're also probably, they recognize the importance of how taking care of themselves allows them to provide the best care. So how do we balance all that? How do you balance it?
I mean, I think when you're first starting, it's going to be a lot of work. Like, just be cognizant. Like, yeah, you're going to be wearing a lot of hats when you're first starting. You're going to be the secretary, you're going to be the janitor, you're going to be the doctor, you're going to be the telephone operator. So just be cognizant of that. Or if you have just a ton of millions of dollars backing you, then you may not need to do that. But assuming that you're like the majority of clinicians, you want to keep the practice really lean. I think that's essential when you're first starting, is having low overhead. And when you have that low overhead, there's less pressure to cut corners. As later down the road, as you progress and you grow, then you can start delegating, which is what we did. It's like, yeah, I was doing a lot of things, but now we just start delegating. I know how to do it because I've been doing it for years or months. And now I'm like, all right, so this is what the janitor needs to do, or this is what the secretary needs to do, or this is what the virtual assistant needs to do. And I think by having that initial experience of me doing it personally has allowed me to delegate it more effectively versus just starting with the delegation process at the very start of it.
Nice. I think you make a really good point there about knowing everything that needs to be done because you've done it yourself. I know that's something I really stress to our students. If you know how to do every step, then you know how to delegate it, and then you know how it's been done to your level of a liking, right? So it's almost like you are expanding your capacity for providing a service with integrity because you can expand your team. But in order for you to expand your team, you need to know who you need on your team and who's on board with your level of providing the space for your patient. So they're not only are they going to keep the person alive, but they also know how you want to hold space for them. And so I know for many folks listening to this episode, you're either going to be in a couple different camps here. You're thinking of opening up a clinic, or you've been running one and now you're thinking, all right, do I really need to still be there? So, what are some immediate action steps that you can take? And similar to other episodes where we line out what you need to do, like what licenses you need, go ahead and research for your specific state's requirements. Okay, so that's another thing. You may have been doing this for a few years. Perhaps a law has changed. Something has changed the scope of practice or has expanded it or limited it. So maybe you're able to be like, "Hey, I want to be more of an operator of my business now versus the owner of the clinic versus the operator of it." And maybe it's opened up to where, "Hey, I could have more APPs doing this." So again, talking with somebody who knows about your state requirements, checking in with your medical board, state medical board, consult with a healthcare attorney in your state, and again, check those scope of practice laws. I think this also reminds me, I have a note here remind me, you also want to review your malpractice insurance policy requirements. And that's something you should probably do from the start and the get-go, especially if you are an advanced practice practitioner and you're listening. Sometimes you're like, "Oh, yeah, I can do this. I know so and so who's in Florida is doing this, but you're in Texas or something." And the insurance policy that you find online and you just clicked a few buttons and it's like, "Oh, yeah, I can do it." No, listen to our insurance episode with Canyon Clifton, and he talks about that, or he could even navigate you with that. And yeah, so those are some of those actions that I'd say take now.
I do want to touch upon the malpractice side of it because although you may have certain ideas, your malpractice insurance company that you work with may say, actually, we want you to be certified in ketamine therapy, or we need your certificate of completion of the ketamine startup course, or they may require certain things. And so that's another regulatory agency that's going to, in a way, determine how you practice. So touching base with the malpractice professional liability company so that, for example, let's say you were planning on having just nurses and you're not even in the office, like, well, is my insurance going to cover that? It's like, well, maybe they don't. Maybe they actually want you to be present in the office and readily available. They'll say, yeah, if you don't have that, we're not going to cover you for insurance. So that's another important thing. We didn't really talk a lot about that, but there's just so many layers of opening up a private practice, doing ketamine infusions. And yeah, in a way, I guess it's good, right? Because the more barriers there are, and we've talked about this before, the harder it is. But yet it also offers kind of like a moat of business protection in a way, because the fact that there are so many regulations and rules and regulatory agencies means that it's not easy to enter the space, that it takes work and dedication, and it's going to weed out people who aren't necessarily dedicated and don't want to put in the work.
I like that perspective shift because I know that's something that we share with many of the students and folks who consult with us is that this is a moat and this moat is good and can be good for you, especially if you view it in that way. So I think to wrap it up, since this is the sun is setting on this conversation, on this episode, and just to boil it down again, take what you learned today to be informed, to help you be informed and make a decision that is based on your values and providing a high level of care for your patients. And as you grow your practice or you start it. So again, you remember to talk with a healthcare attorney in your state, touch base with the state medical board, your insurance carrier, professional liability insurance carrier. You could even touch base with some other ketamine clinic owners in your state. And hopefully you already have a relationship with some of them, friendly. And so you can talk with them to see what their experience is or if they've had to expand or how they've done any changes to their way of practicing. And of course, there's professional organizations that you could touch base with. Is there any last things you want
Yeah.
to talk?
And you can always reach out to us. I mean, this is our passion. project, and we love helping other clinicians get into the space. So we're available for you as a resource. And if I had to bottom line, the take-home message is when you're thinking about your practice, think about it from the perspective of like, what would I want for my loved one? What would I want for my son or daughter or best friend? Like, how would I want them to be treated? And I think if you have that constantly in the back of your mind, like, you're not going to go wrong. Assuming that the person that you're thinking about is someone you really care about, of course.
That you love your friend or your son.
Yeah, it's not like, what would I want for my enemy's ketamine clinic experience to be versus, of course, like, hey, if I really cared about someone and they were close to me, like, how would I want them to be taken care of? Who would I want there? What would I want available for that person? Like, you're a clinician, you know what the right thing is for your personal preferences and values and what's important. So I think if you go by that internal judge that you have of integrity, I think you're not going to go wrong.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Ketamine Startup Podcast. If you found this episode helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps other medical professionals like you discover the show and grow the community. For show notes and resources, visit our website at ketaminestartup.com/podcast. And remember, the information shared today is for educational purposes only. Always consult with a qualified business attorney and accountant regarding licensing, regulatory requirements specific to your state and location. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.